Hi, this is John Quinlan. Welcome to Forward Forum. We're taping this here at the Sun Prairie Media Center on January 6, 2017. And our focus today is on good government in Wisconsin. And very pleased to have two of my favorite people in studio as my guests. Andrea Kaminski is here from the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, and Matt Rothschild is here from the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. Hey, welcome.
Thank you.
And just to mention at the outset briefly, we want to thank, as always, the generous support of the EVU Foundation and the folks here at the Sun Prairie Media Center. We're beginning efforts now. We're going to try to get weekly programs going again here on Forward Forum, and are also engaging an audience. We hope that will be more statewide. So please stay tuned. www.forwardforum.net is your place to find out more about our program. But so we're sitting here on January 6th, and of course a time of transition in terms of the national leadership. We've just passed a very volatile election year. With that in mind, I guess I think when I've had conversations with both of you, both online and offline, the steam keeps on coming back. That I think the thing that we all can invest in, no matter what our political perspective, is we need to fix the broken system. Very often, people don't feel like they can engage, or that voting or participation, makes a difference. But Andrea, let's start with you. What does the League do to address those concerns?
Well, the League was founded in 1920 when women won the right to vote. It was founded by those suffragists who had engaged in a 70-year struggle to win the right to vote for women. And the idea was to educate all of a sudden 20 million new people enfranchised in the country, new citizens, well, citizens who were newly enfranchised.
Right.
And the idea was to educate women in the issues and give them an opportunity to study those issues and then act on them as voters and as citizens. And of course, our mission has broadened in the 96, 97 years since then. And now the League is women and men, people of all political stripes. And the mission is simply to advocate for active and informed participation in government. And that means voting. That means in between elections, getting people to let their representatives know how they feel about different issues. Getting informed is important, to stay informed between elections. And being active in their communities, possibly running for office themselves, being on commissions, and so forth. So the League does voter education, completely nonpartisan. We never endorse or oppose any political party or candidate. We do candidate forums. We do voter guides. We have an online voter guide and with candidates' answers. And we also advocate based on our positions. Never take a position on a candidate or a party, but we do on issues after our members have studied them and come to consensus on a position. So
it's an interesting distinction. So part of it is you take a stand on bad process. So on the need for there to be adequate notice, an effort to involve the public in the process. But you also take a stand on a particular issue like the environment, for example? Yes, we have positions in
96 years we've studied a lot of positions. And we have positions in that good government area. We believe in transparent government with plenty of public input and fair elections. But also we have positions in natural resources. In Wisconsin, we have strong positions in energy policy and water, preservation of water quality and quantity and other issues, but also in social policy. Health care, aging care,
women's reproductive rights,
okay. And so forth.
And then civil rights related issues as
public education.
Yeah.
Yes, civil rights, definitely. It's a civil rights organization. It's a suffrage organization.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm. Well, I want to come back and parse out this and maybe again, partly some of the misconceptions people have and the ways you get pigeonholed that maybe aren't consistent with the way things work in practice. Let's go to Matt Matt, I think a good way to get started, maybe just to again explain a little bit about what Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, what your current focus is. Of course, is to remark on the fact that for 30 years, almost, you were involved with an organization called the Progressive Magazine, first as reporter, editor, and publisher. And I just wonder if you could remark on some of the transitions. You moved from a publication where as a journalist you were commenting on worldwide events to this statewide focus, this focus on good government. What does that mean in practice for you?
Well, I've really enjoyed the transition in moving over to the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign over the last 2 years. Part of it is trying to make a tangible, have a tangible effect on what's going on, and to just focus my energies and our organization's energies on what's going on in Wisconsin, especially because things are so dire here in Wisconsin with this counter-revolution we've been under with the Walker wrecking crew, as I like to call it, and just to try to figure out how best to use our talents at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign to try to defend democracy in Wisconsin and expose some of the corruption that's been going on. Because you asked why the process is broken.
No, absolutely.
One of the reasons it's broken is because of money. I mean, here we have Scott Walker who's imposing his agenda, but it's not really his agenda. It's the agenda of the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's the agenda of Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. It's the agenda of the Koch brothers. So he's just a water boy. Scott Fitzgerald is a water boy. Robin Voss is a water boy. Chief Justice Rogensack is a water girl for this same group of people who are running the show here in Wisconsin, but we don't see their fingerprints all that often. But that's what's going on in Wisconsin and what's been happening. So we try to draw attention to the hidden role of money in Wisconsin, one of the assets of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign that's unique. And we love working with League of Women Voters and Common Cause of Wisconsin and other allied groups. The one thing we have is a database of contributors, campaign contributors, more than 1 million campaign contributions. We've coded, one person actually in our office has coded 1 million contributions over the last 20 years and put them into our database.
So not people who contributed to the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, no. People who contributed to campaigns.
Yeah, people who gave money to Walker, people who gave money to the Democrats.
Right.
And you can just go to our website at wisdc.org and put in a candidate's name, whether it's Scott Walker or whether it's Tom Barrett or whoever, Mary Burke, put in their names and see who gave them money. And then sometimes when there's legislation coming forward, and one of the amazing things at my job is I see the legislation that's being proposed and I say, wow, what's that all about? I didn't hear about this during the campaign. Well, then we look at the sponsor of the legislation and then who's giving that sponsor money, and somehow that sometimes gives us an answer as to why this piece of legislation is coming forward.
And we've talked about this in advance, but again, the two organizations have a resonant purpose, but also a different purpose. I don't think you would necessarily go quite the same direction Matt did in terms of the Walker administration or specific critiques of one party or another. Your approach perhaps is a bit more nonpartisan?
We certainly have strong positions in favor of public financing for elections and opposing the undue influence of big money. But yeah, we don't have quite the same approach as Wisconsin Democracy Campaign with two different organizations.
So it's self-evident, but for our viewers, again, each of you is going to be speaking from a slightly different perspective, purpose, all of that in mind. But Matt, the reason I was early on, I would just want to respond to it is, I think part of the reason why you're mentioning all these folks is, for better or for worse, the proponents of open government are largely on one part of the ideological spectrum, and I think the opponents of good process and other things are on the other. So that drives part of what you're doing. But on the other hand, you definitely critique the Democrats in excess.
Yeah, and we critiqued the Doyle administration when it was engaging in policies that we thought were not the best policies for democracy in Wisconsin and openness in Wisconsin. And, we urged the Doyle administration to pass campaign finance, which it didn't do, campaign finance reform. So we are nonpartisan. We're partisans for democracy. We are nonpartisan. We don't endorse candidates or tell people who to vote for, who not to vote for, which party to vote for, which party not to vote for. But when people who are in power are enacting policies that are inimical to the smooth functioning and efficient functioning of democracy, where everyone has a voice and everyone's voice can be heard, then it's our obligation to point that out. And so we do that.
And of course, ideally, it should be a nonpartisan issue. It was the McCain-Feingold campaign reform. So there should be partnerships across.
I think
the lines.
openness, transparency in our democracy should be a bipartisan issue, and having a system that's not rigged. And there are a lot of ways that it's rigged. It's rigged because of the money. It's rigged because of the redistricting. And one of the great things that's happened over the last year is this lawsuit against the rigged drawing of district maps that happened in 2011 in top secret.
Yeah.
The gerrymandering. And then you had a bipartisan effort led by Tim Cullen and Dale Schultz. Both were Senate Majority Leaders from different parties, one a Democrat and one a Republican, trying to lead this effort to expose that problem of rigged drawing of legislative maps. And they've won in the district court. It's been exciting.
Frankly, had the Democrats done some of these things that Matt mentioned, campaign finance and redistricting reform, when they were in power, they had they had both houses of the legislature and the governor's office. We wouldn't be where we are right now, and the Democrats, more important, the Democrats wouldn't be where they are right now.
So in the moment, whatever party is in power takes advantage of the disadvantage of the other party.
Well,
rather than doing the right thing and leveling the playing field, they're
Yeah.
doing like they do in Iowa and having districts drawn in a nonpartisan way, for example.
Well, it's interesting. We have in our state office a letter when it comes to redistricting. Right now, the League, along with Democracy Campaign and Common Cause and others, we're all supporting nonpartisan redistricting reform.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the fact is the League has been supporting this since the 1970s. We've had a position stating that we think that the district maps shouldn't be drawn by the elected officials who stand to gain by it. And so we've had this position since the 1970s. Right now, that lines up with the Democrats in the state capitol. However, we have a letter in our state office from I'm blanking on his name right now, but the former speaker, a Democrat in the 1980s, who I think was from Sun Prairie. And he
We'll think of it before the hour's out.
Tom Loftus, maybe?
No. But he was blasting the League for supporting this Republican plan to do nonpartisan redistricting. Yeah. So that was back then. Then the Democrats were opposing it. Now the Republicans are opposing it. All that changed, the League's position didn't change. All that changed was who was in power in the legislature.
And of course, the other thing to understand about gerrymandering, it's not just about favoring Democrats or Republicans overall and having the absurdity here that the majority of people vote for one party and yet that's not reflected in the legislature. That's part of it. But a lot of it is essentially, the system is set up to benefit incumbents and to disadvantage challengers. Yeah. And that's not good either.
No, that's not good. And we should be encouraging people to run for office. We need good people to run for office with different views so that voters have choice.
But if you look
right now, voters don't have much choice.
If you look at the second CD, when I was growing up, that was a district that included places like Beaver Dam and Watertown when Bob Kastenmeier was in office. And yet, again, ironically, I love Mark Pocan, he's a great friend, but this system benefits him too. And and then the districts the way they're drawn and up by Oshkosh or whatever benefit Glenn Grothman, but
who it doesn't benefit is voters.
Exactly.
It doesn't benefit voters because they don't have as much choice between two viable candidates.
Does that make sense, man?
Yeah, and it's just ridiculous that the party that happens to win when the census is being taken gets to impose its geographic maps on who gets to vote in what district, and can pack, if you're a Republican, can pack the Democrats all in fewer and fewer districts, or if you're a Democrat in power, you can pack the Republicans in fewer and fewer districts and therefore have an ability to hang on to power for as long as possible. I mean, if Iowa can do it for 35 years, why can't we do it here? Why can't we have a nonpartisan, neutral drawing of the maps by career civil servants who aren't trying to favor one party or another?
I don't know if it's the only example, but does that bear fruit in Iowa? Are they less likely to go in these 10-year cycles where one party is in control or whatever? Does it mean that there's a better chance that a diversity of views are represented?
Their districts are more competitive. Their maps are much cheaper to draw. And, they spend maybe $10,000 or $20,000. I'm probably exaggerating. $20,000 to $40,000
Okay.
To develop their maps, and most of the expenses apparently are to have hearings in different parts of the state, so they're travel expenses, and there's no litigation. Our last redistricting went well over $2 million because of all the litigation that followed.
And the idea of having public hearings, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Compare that in Iowa, where they have public hearings all around the state, to what happened when Fitzgerald was drawing the maps. Here in 2011, they did it in secret at the Glass Bank on the Capitol in Madison at the pricey law firm Michael Best and Friedrich.
Yeah.
They locked the doors. The public couldn't come in. The media couldn't come in. Democrats couldn't come in. Even Republican legislators had to be allowed in by a staffer of Fitzgerald who had the keys to the locked room, which was incidentally called the map room at Michael Best. And then when the Republican legislators walked in to see what was going on with their district, they had to sign an oath of secrecy as what was happening in this room. And what was happening in the map room was there was a sophisticated computer program where they could change the lines, and the more they changed the lines in their direction, they could see how many more seats they were likely to get and hold on to. So it was a totally rigged effort to secure partisan advantage.
So this is implicit in everything you're saying, but so much of the political culture is about these statisticians and policy wonks and consultants who essentially tell you that this is the way the game is played, this is the way you should play it. And that is often to the detriment of the pure expression, the inclusive, pluralistic expression of democracy.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this current lawsuit that is in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin gerrymandering lawsuit, was designed to, it was designed to create a metric that shows when there's partisan gerrymandering, how many votes are basically wasted. If you're in a safe district, whether, let's say it's a Democratic-led district, whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, your vote doesn't count for all that much.
Yeah.
And that's because there's going to be this wide gap, and if you're a Republican, you're never going to be represented. If you're a Democrat, well, they don't need all of your votes, and so there's this wastage of votes, this waste of votes. And this was actually developed because a few decades ago, I think it was in the 1990s, the U.S. Supreme Court looked at partisan gerrymandering, and they said, well, politicians are going to be political, they're going to be partisan, but Justice Anthony Kennedy said, but what I would like to see, so they ruled that partisan gerrymandering in that case was acceptable, but what Justice Kennedy said is, I would like to see a measure, a metric, a way to know how does this reduce the voting clout of citizens when there's extreme partisan gerrymandering. And that's what this lawsuit was designed to answer his call.
And let me just, one distinction. Yeah. So I think a lot of the case law around gerrymandering hasn't been so much about preventing excesses of partisanship. It's been based in racial discrimination, for example.
The Voting Rights Act.
And if I'm understanding it correctly, this recent federal court decision, which 2 of the 3 federal judges said it's excessive, it's one of the worst excesses, the way it's played out here in Wisconsin, it is saying that when there's partisan advantage, that is something that should not be permitted. And of course, there are implications here for racial justice and inclusiveness and groups that are allowed. But I mean, is that widening the way we look at this issue in a good way? Yeah.
What the whole idea was that this will go to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it will be a test of whether in addition to racial gerrymandering and that partisan gerrymandering also reduces the voting rights and the voting strength of the people.
I mean, that was the landmark aspect of this case. It was the first time that federal judges have ruled partisan gerrymandering to be unconstitutional. And as Andrea was saying, the beauty of the case, it's called the Whitford case, the beauty of the case is that the plaintiffs came up with this metric, this yardstick, that can be applied whether it's Republicans doing rigging of the maps in Wisconsin or whether it's Democrats doing rigging of the maps in Illinois or Democrats doing it in Massachusetts. It can be used neutrally all across the country to measure the degree of obscene rigging of the maps. And That's why the plaintiffs in this case think they're going to win on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, because Anthony Kennedy was essentially begging for a yardstick, begging for a neutral metric, and they provided it.
And just as he was on gay rights and a number of other issues, he's the swing vote very often. So if you bring him around, there's a fairly good likelihood this will.
He's the swing vote even if Trump gets his nominee.
Right.
And this ruling that says that the maps are unconstitutional in Wisconsin was written by a Reagan appointee. That's got to help.
Right.
So
absolutely. Yeah. So just in the broader spectrum of things, again, it very often seems that the folks who were in power at the time just kind of justify that this is just the way it is, sort of what you were alluding to earlier. These early court rulings said, well, politics are politics, and so so someone is an advantage every 10 years. That's kind of the way it is. But I think you want to shake that notion up. And again, I think of Representative Grothman's statements. Essentially, he's very pleased with how the voter suppression techniques had benefited the Republicans. I mean, it's not okay to think that, no matter where you come from.
Exactly, and just to keep with the redistricting case for a second, I was in the courtroom for closing arguments in that case, and Brad Schimmel, the Attorney General's deputy, gave a closing argument, which I thought was appalling, and he said, basically, this is democracy at work. We won, we get to draw the maps.
Right.
And whether it's in secret, whether it's as manipulative and grotesque, no matter what, we get to draw the maps. That's how it's played. And I think when you present that to the people of Wisconsin, they're going to say, really, that's not the way we want our democracy to be played.
Gerrymander, I'm sorry, go ahead, Andrea.
It's a very dangerous notion to just say that this is the way politics is, and that they're all crooked. That keeps people from voting. It turns people off. And in fact, once somebody says that, they're already turned off. And first of all, it isn't true. And secondly, there are ways to keep that from happening. And part of it is to expose what's really going on, what's behind some of this legislation that we're seeing by following the money. And another is just by people being informed and voting. So, and not giving up.
Well, it is, this is a crucial issue that I wrestle with at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. How do we talk about corruption in a way that doesn't make people just tune out and say, well, the whole system's rigged, forget about it, I'm not even going to participate in politics because it's useless.
There are folks on the left that are natural allies, too, that really fall into a conspiracy theory where everything's messed up. Why should I even bother? I mean, folks on both parts of the spectrum.
Yeah, so we need to stress that, as Andrea says, not all politicians are corrupt, and there's a way to clean the system up to make it less corrupt so that our voices are heard. And one of the disastrous things that happened in Wisconsin over the last year and a half is the rewrite of our campaign finance law, which really tore down any ceilings on donations to political parties. I mean, it used to be the limit was $10,000. That's all you could. If you wanted to support the Democratic Party, the most you could give them was $10,000. Now the sky is the limit. So we have individuals, super wealthy individuals in Wisconsin, giving $1 million to the Republican Party of Wisconsin or $1 million to the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. And, you can give unlimited amounts to PACs now. I mean, the sky's the limit with how much influence the wealthiest people and the more well-connected people in the state can do with their money. And I think for people in Wisconsin who've believed in clean government and open government, and the idea that we all have, one person, one vote, it's kind of mocked by this now, you can spend as much money as possible. I like to say, the people who passed this law in their wisdom said it's okay for the poor person and the billionaire to give, $1 million to the political party of their choice, because of course the poor person can't do that.
So you've hit on something that we've touched on in previous discussions, man. I remember when you came and spoke at my church, this is the question I asked you afterwards, and I think I've talked to you about this too, Andrea. I mean, you guys have this dilemma. Is part of the way that you get people fired up and engaged with this is to say how bad things are. But if you spend the first hour of a presentation bringing people down, how do you possibly get them fired up about the possibilities? And I think part of this is let's not be ahistorical about this. You're mentioning the origins of the League occurred at this time of women's suffrage. How outrageous that we went through much of our early history without women being able to have the vote. But the arc of history curved in the right direction. And when African Americans got the vote, of course, Jim Crow prevented that from happening. But 50 years ago, a number of things happened, actually in a relatively short period of time, that turned that around. One of the things Mike McCabe talks about is the LGBT movement. 10 years ago, who would have guessed that we'd have made some of the strides we have? So could you just reflect on that? you know, as much as you guys see the downside and the horrible excesses when money and you know, and corruption, you know, mess up things, you know, what gives you hope? Let's start with you, Andrea.
One thing I learned early on, I started working for the League in 2004, and there was an election that fall that brought in a more conservative wave into the state capitol, into the legislature. And we saw that a number of our positions were probably, it was going to be a lot harder to fight for a number of our positions. And so our legislative committee got together and started talking about it. And at first, everybody was really, you know, oh boy, this is bad. What are we going to do? By the end of an hour, they were talking about, well, we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to dig right in. They were talking about different types of legislation that they expected to see, and how best will we respond to it. And I realized that this was a group of, at that point it was all women, who have been doing this as volunteers for decades.
Yeah.
And they really take the long view. And I expect that to happen again. We all got together, our Ledge Committee met in late November, and again, we were, you know, everybody was going, wow, it's going to be tough this time around. But they came up with a couple of bills that they would like to see, a couple of positive, forward-looking things like allowing driver cards for immigrants and for undocumented immigrants, and also a lot of defense. We also looked at ways that, given that we now have voter ID, the League challenged the voter ID law, and we were part of a number of other organizations like ACLU. We helped hold it off through 11 elections in 3 years.
Yeah.
But we've got voter ID in place. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to use the data from our election observation programs and try to get that list of acceptable IDs expanded. Try to get an affidavit option for people who really can't come up with an acceptable photo ID.
So before we come to Matt, one of the strengths, I think, of your organization, and this is implicit in this, again, those women who have worked on these issues for decades, who remember a time when we had so far to go and do realize that history ebbs and flows, we do make progress. But what I guess I would like to emphasize is the intergenerational aspect of what you're doing. Because I think one of the hard things for a lot of the young people who got engaged in the process this last year is just feeling like it was all for nothing. You know, we worked so hard, we poured our hearts out into these efforts, and yet the outcome seemed rigged. It seemed like there was no connection between what we did. And I think one of the powerful things a group like the League can do is to kind of put that in perspective, to understand it's always been that way. We always have to work 100 times as hard as the other side, and yet there are things we can do.
One of them was saying something, one of them yesterday was talking to me on the phone about the McCarthy era.
Yeah.
And, you know, I hadn't thought of that, but yes, we've seen dark times, and we can come through it.
And you and I talk about, again, that in 1957 we had Joe McCarthy as our senator, and yet 6 years later we had Prox Nelson, in office.
Yeah.
And so change does happen. We're talking about 1910.
I mean, nothing is static.
That's
That's the thing. So history gives me hope, and I'm a student of Howard Zinn's. Not that I took his classes at Boston University, but I've read his work, and he used to write for the Progressive magazine, and he always teaches us that we don't know when progressive social change is going to erupt, but it has a better chance of erupting if we work at it than if we don't. And look at the turn of the 20th century, back in the 1890s, I mean, the Capitol was grotesquely corrupt here in Madison. People were passing around, shoeboxes full of money. And it took Robert LaFollette to come along, the progressive movement to come along, to change that. So change happens, it happens from below, and it's important to work on it. Another thing that gives me hope is working in this progressive pro-democracy nonprofit sector in Wisconsin, which is so strong. We have Andrea Kaminski here at the League and Jay Heck and a whole bunch of other great people across issues, environmental issues too, and all civil rights issues, criminal justice issues.
In every corner of the state.
Yeah, in every corner of the state. We're working together in coalition as never before, which is a very exciting thing. It is intergenerational. There are a lot of younger people coming up behind us, which is great and exciting to see. And so those are some of the things that give us hope. And then there's, let me give you one example. There's a group called Wisconsin United to Amend that has passed 96 resolutions in 96 communities across the state of Wisconsin.
Including Waukesha County.
Yeah, to try to, saying that the people of those communities, by overwhelming numbers, want to amend the U.S. Constitution finally to proclaim that corporations aren't persons and money isn't speech. So there's a lot of stuff going on at the grassroots here in Wisconsin that's very positive, that we don't see in the mainstream corporate media, but gives me hope, and I think gives a lot of people hope, that we're going to change this state and save democracy here in Wisconsin and across the country.
So there's something I want to interject just a minute, which is something you both share. Your organizations are supported by a group called Community Shares, so don't let me lose that point. But just to finish on this, though, again, I think we're sitting here again on January 6, 2017, and reflecting, if nothing else, on Facebook, which is or isn't sometimes a reflection of the real world. There's still a lot of people just kind of really feeling wounded. There's almost a psychotherapeutic aspect to this. People are feeling depressed and really feeling like, again, there's nothing I can do. Things just got overwhelming. No matter what happens, democracy is so messed up that we'll never get through this. And again, I think some of that is being ahistorical. And it's hard for a young person who hasn't lived through these earlier eras to understand that. But let me just go to both of you again. In your work, and as you travel the state, how do you overcome that sense of inevitability or lethargy or other things that really weighs us down? That really, ironically, I think frankly, that 1% or the elites would like us to feel that way. They don't want us to feel empowered. How do you counter that dynamic?
Well, I always, when I go speak, I always hand out a few pieces of inspiration, not that I've written, but from Howard Zinn, or a bit of poetry. There's the poem from Seamus Haney, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice rises up and hope and history rhyme.
Yeah.
And so we need to make hope and history rhyme again. And just to give people an idea, that, or Ta-Nehisi Coates has a great book, a great quote in his book, Between the World and Me, where he says, we're not guaranteed to win when we struggle, but it does guarantee us a couple things. It guarantees us a sane and intelligent life. And so we need to, act with thoughtfulness and sanity. And then I remember the instruction from Eastern European activists, for instance, the poet Václav Havel, who led the resistance in Czechoslovakia and then was the first president of the Czech Republic. He said, even though we're living under oppression, we need to live the way we ideally want to live. And we need just to assume that we have power and act as though we have power. It's kind of like the Gandhian slogan about be the change you want to be, but it's an adaptation. And, we're going to live as though we've already won, and we're living in the society we want to live in.
Mandela's South Africa, another place of inspiration.
Yeah, I came out of the anti-apartheid movement in college in the late 1970s, and so, I was working with people from the African National Congress who came and spoke on campus, and then we asked him out for drinks later, and he said, I'm not going to have a drink until apartheid's over. Yeah. And apartheid didn't end 12 years later, so he had to wait to have his first taste of beer, but he took the long view. He understood what was happening. Look at Nelson Mandela, was in jail for 27 years and came out and became president of South Africa.
I was talking to Joe Elder about this too, and given that my mom lived in India for 4 years and I've traveled back there, or for example, Korea, where my father was, and you and I have talked about this. These are thriving democracies, but they've had their challenges. But they're also, at least in the case of India, very pluralistic societies like our own. That I think the news we get is only of the scandals or the abuses or the surges of nationalism and violence. But actually, India is this country of 1.2 billion people where democracy is cherished, and in many ways it's thriving. Anyway, there are examples all around the world. This American exceptionalism that says we have all the answers. If only we would look and be inspired by some of the other things happening.
But I don't want to downplay the threat right now, though.
Right.
Because democracies can end in a hurry. I mean, Chile had a democracy for 20 years, for 100 years, and it ended in a night.
Yeah.
And here we have elected a president of the United States who's the closest thing to an American fascist we've ever had in the Oval Office. And this raises real questions. And so how do people respond to that? One way to respond to it is try to help the people who are most in jeopardy right now, who are in the crosshairs of Donald Trump's policy, and that is our neighbors who are Muslim, our neighbors who are undocumented immigrants. We need to embrace them and acknowledge them and let them know that they have shelter in our places of worship or even in our homes if it's going to come to that. And so I think that's kind of a first step. And there is a big rally on January 14th in Milwaukee in support of immigrant and refugee rights and kind of a broad united front coalition against this agenda that may be imposed upon us. And I think we need to be prepared to get into the streets. If we don't exercise our rights, essentially we've surrendered our rights. So it's important to protest too.
So just one other indication, I think, of international examples. When Mike McCabe was sitting in this chair, he talked about being a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali. And in many ways, a lot of the work he's doing now on behalf of democracy was inspired by village life, by democracy, at that local level in a place like Mali. But I alluded to this, but you and I were part of a program 6 years ago with our mutual friend Gene Matthews, a guy who'd written about the way that missionaries and other folks in the context of Korea had stood up to an extremely oppressive military regime. We think North Korea bad, South Korea good, but it's much more complicated than that. And in 1975, 8 people were wrongly executed. People were living in fear. What should have been a thriving democracy was really in danger. And yet 20 years later, the person who was the freedom fighter, Kim Dae-jung, who had been injured in battle, was the president. So, I mean, are there lessons there for the way that arc of history happens and what people can do?
Well, I mean, we see this a lot. I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma.
Yeah.
She was under house arrest forever and a day.
10 years ago, who could have guessed that she'd come out of that?
She's leaving the country. Mandela, Kim Dae-jung. I mean, so people have fought against oppressive conditions, more oppressive than we have right now, more depressing, more seemingly intractable, and have managed to win. I mean, Chile was under dictatorship, and they overthrew the dictatorship democratically. I mean, Pinochet did win like 43 or 44% in that last plebiscite when he finally left office. But there's always people organizing and struggling and fighting for democratic progress in whatever society you're in. And here in the United States and here in Wisconsin, it's just it's getting more intense right now. And we just are going to have to work a little bit harder. But the other thing is, I always say, do it with friends. Right. Have fun doing it. If it's just a task, if you're just banging your head against the wall, who's going to do it? Right. And so do it with people you like, people who are kind, people who are good cooks, people with senses of humor. Yeah. And sustain yourselves, be kind to ourselves, and keep going.
Yeah. No, again, I'm obviously trying to loop around to the positive, but the other aspect, lessons that we're talking about with all of these things is democracy is a fragile experiment. You have to be vigilant about it. So that's what Chile was at that point and Korea was. We're in a similar junction here in many ways. We really can't take for granted that, unfortunately, very disturbing developments that are diluting democracy, that are leading to an oligarchy, they have to be overturned.
I mean, Jimmy Carter said, and then I'm going to let Andrea talk because I feel like I'm talking too much, which I just flap my mouth off whenever I get a
We're going to talk about the importance of women having a voice in politics, but we'll model that in a minute.
But you mentioned oligarchy, so it just, Jimmy Carter said about a year and a half ago, we don't have a democracy in America anymore. We have an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. And Bernie, of course, talked a lot about the oligarchy.
Yeah. Well, I agree that we are in a very dangerous situation. I agree with Matt on that. Back in 2011, we started to see, we saw the collective bargaining bill and a lot of the voter ID bill, and which became law, both of them, and so forth. And we've also seen in the past several years attacks on some of the government watchdogs. The Legislative Audit Bureau, the Supreme Court, the Judicial Commission, and an attack in a late night pre-holiday weekend attack in the very last stage of the last budget on our open meetings laws. And I have been surprised all along. I thought, well, we've got good checks and balances. Wisconsin is a good government state. They can't do this. They can't destroy our government. I've been sad by how much has really been changed in the way our legislature works and the way our government works, and that gets me worried. And then wake up Monday morning this week, and we find that or I guess it was Tuesday, the Republicans in the Congress, the congressional Republicans, had voted against Paul Ryan's wishes to do away with the Office of Congressional Ethics. And I had this bad feeling of deja vu.
Yeah.
This is all very fragile. They've stepped back on that, and that's good. But we need to be vigilant. We need to not let go. And I guess what gives me hope, Matt said that you really enjoy going around the state and meeting with people, and I have to say that that's been a great thing for me in the past year. The League launched a minivan tour. We went to 33 community events around the state, drove 6,500 miles, had 200 volunteers involved, local volunteers, and we got to see people at, county fairs and senior centers and college campuses and so forth all around the state. And I was amazed by how engaged people were in general. Sure, there were some people who were just cynical and they just said, oh, I've got nothing to do with politics. But there were a lot of people who had a lot of questions, and they were very engaged. And seeing our local volunteers who didn't care, who you're going to vote for, we just want you to be informed. And we want you to vote. We want you to get registered. It's harder to do now, but we're going to help you do that. Yeah. And so I guess that gives me hope.
All right.
Seeing real people.
Just to give you a heads up, I guess we're about 2/3 of the way through the show, so there's several things I want to bring back into it, but we're on a good track. Actually, let's I do want to make sure to mention, because you share this, and again, in those two chairs where you're sitting, we're going to be recognizing an organization that's been around for about 30 years called Community Shares of Wisconsin. And in terms of garnering support, much more bottom-up philanthropic approach or other things, it really epitomizes that. And I know that being part of Community Shares and that collective body of people that embrace those notions are really important. We're in an important transition, and that someone who has led that organization since the early 90s, different roles, Crystal Anders, is about to leave us. Again, reflections on Community Shares roles and the role that Crystal has played, if you could.
Sure. Community Shares is a great organization. When I started with the League 12 years ago, I heard that we got money from Community Shares. That was wonderful. But boy, I learned very quickly that it's so much more than that. And it really is a community. It offers, it has now more than 50 nonprofits that get at the root causes of inequity and so forth, and works for a fair state that provides for its people, and that has clean water and air, and Community Shares is wonderful. And
so just to punctuate it, it's workplace giving access is part of the reason it exists, but all these other things that you're talking about as well.
And Crystal Anders, the outgoing executive director, has been there something like 24 years, I think, and she's done so much as a leader of not only that organization, but that community that is Community Shares.
And she's been a national leader as well.
She has, and she's a role model. And I actually first met her when she was with Wisconsin Women's Network, and she was leading a committee on Take Your Daughter to Work Day, and this was in like the early 1980s. But she's a fantastic person.
Matt, if you could just reflect on both Community Shares and CSW, but also maybe go back to your earlier role as someone who charted the progressive movement. Again, very often philanthropy in its worst form is very kind of condescending, a lot of folks with wealth assuming that they know what's best for people rather than it bubbling up from the grassroots. So could you talk a little bit about how community shares?
Community shares is grassroots. It solicits donations and distributes contributions to all these groups in the nonprofit sector. And Crystal, really a model leader of the nonprofit sector here in Wisconsin and nationally. I mean, incredibly smart, incredibly dedicated, incredibly warm, and just so able across the board. And she's just done a terrific job with Community Shares. And my emphasis, I think like Andrea's, is on the community part of the Community Shares, because she's really made it a community, this network of nonprofits under the umbrella of Community Shares, which is tremendous. And there are other umbrellas too. There's Wisconsin Network for Peace and Justice, and there's Wisconsin Voices and Our Democracy 2020. That's what I mean when I say we're all working together in ways that I didn't even know about 2 years ago when I was still at the Progressive, but now my eyes are wide open, and it is an amazing kind of cohesive force here under the radar. It's doing really good work. And yeah, on philanthropy, I mean, I think, you know, I've been in the begging business now for about 35 years, and not too proud to beg.
Just did your end-of-year pitch recently.
Not too proud to ask people for money, and you need to when you're running nonprofits. It's how we survive. I mean, all of us, I think, operate on shoestrings almost, and so, you know, we just need to go out and ask people, but, you know, we're not beholden to people either, or to foundations, though we get money from some wealthy people and some foundations, but most of all our organizations, most of the donations are small donations, and that's who we rely on. That gives us independence. So I'm all for that, and people should understand we're nonprofit, we're tax deductible. League of Women Voters is nonprofit, tax deductible, and so I'm just so grateful for everyone in Wisconsin who supports the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign and our whole network of nonprofits, and people who give through Community Shares. It's just an amazing way to support the work that's going on, and this sector is a really, really vibrant and important sector.
One thing about Community Shares is that when somebody contributes to Community Shares through their workplace giving, if they designate an organization, Wisconsin Democracy Campaign or the League, 100% of what they designate goes to that organization, and that is greatly appreciated. And
you wouldn't have that access without a Community Shares.
Absolutely not. And that's money that we can use to do what we do so well. It isn't designated for one thing.
So again, not to phrase this as a negative relative to other philanthropic organizations, but to turn it on its head, again, it's really exceptional that the very decision-making process is driven, again, from the grassroots, that the folks that are running those kitchen table organizations and everything are also the folks that are making the overall decisions about priorities and other things. And that's really the only way, I think, for philanthropy to successfully connect and be effective. If you try to impose your will on someone by virtue of the money that you're pumping into things, that really doesn't affect change in the way that a bottom-up Community Shares approach does. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It's kind of a democratically run organization and a movement. It's really kind of a movement. And I believe it is the oldest of its kind, of its social welfare fund in the country.
I believe it goes back to 72. Aid to Wisconsin Organizations, Madison Sustaining Fund were the two groups that merged. I chaired that meeting back in 1985 or 6 or something. And so no,
so I mean, you're a father of it,
right? Well, in part, but no. I think I appreciate us engaging with this because again, I think the mission of CSW is very resonant with the mission of your two groups.
Absolutely.
Yeah, is a very bottom up, involve people in the process approach.
And it also brings organizational staff and leaders together across the state, which is very important.
Absolutely. I wanted to come back to something that you alluded to earlier, that a lot of your focus right now is on the state budget. Could you talk about how your respective organizations consider that to be a priority?
The League has long been involved every 2 years in the state budget and advocacy. We believe that government needs revenue.
Make it synonymous with fiscal responsibility, but they're really two different things. And Matt, I know you've written about this a lot over the years. Again, austerity is a code word for let's get rid of government. Let's deregulate everything and have it be in the private sector. And it is part of a pretty insidious movement and everything. And taking off of Andrea's point, is it really a matter that we have limited resources? We can't fund the schools anymore. We can't do the things we're doing. Can't provide for the social welfare. Or is that kind of a facade?
It's a facade. and it's a callous and calculated one. We've been victimized by budget blackmail, by this idea that there's just simply no money to pay for the urgent things that we need for the roads repairs, for the school funding, for the things that we really need to create thriving communities. But if you just look at two tax loopholes, you know, the manufacturing and ag credit and the capital gains loophole, there's $900 million there. If you just got rid of those two loopholes, so what could we do with $900 million? Why, we could do a whole hell of a lot to make our communities thrive, to help people get a living wage in this state of ours, and to take care of some health care needs. So there's just so much we could do in this idea that, you know, liberals are tax and spend. Well, Walker taxes, Walker spends. Who does he tax and what does he spend it on?
Which party runs up the biggest deficits, you know, on a federal level?
On the federal level, but even here, where we have to have a balanced budget, how do they balance it? On whose backs do they balance it?
Or the debate around transportation right now.
Right, and who's getting and who's getting the sweets? And the people who are getting the sweets are the people who manipulate the system, and that is the corporations and those who have the well-heeled lobbyists and lawyers to write the laws and throw their money around, and the rest of us don't have those resources.
You wrote a book about socialism and how that was used as some sort of a stain on, you know, what was supposed to happen, but that corporate socialism is alive and well. And anyway, the government essentially does have a role in the role of people.
I mean, open for business was Walker's slogan. It's really, you know, Wisconsin open for bribery. I mean, and so it's the people who know how to work the system, who bribe the politicians and get what they want.
But to have a thriving state, a thriving community, you need to educate your children. You need to educate all the children. You know, and you can look at it from a purely selfish point of view. I want to know that the person who is doing my long-term care someday, and you know, making the beds and so forth, is going to be well trained and is going to have health care and be healthy so they stay with their job and so forth.
So charter schools, in the realm of education, a lot of things, the notion that privatization in the private sector is good because it produces innovation. You know, you're not being bogged down in the government bureaucracy or whatever. I imagine you have another side to that because, again, government does have a role to ensure the collective good.
And to ensure equity and to ensure quality. Yes, I think in education that it's very disturbing to see money going to schools that aren't held to the same standards.
Because in things like charter schools, it's sort of implicit. Well, this has a really good track record. Well, first of all, that's debatable, but it's helping a small number of people, and who is it excluding? It's excluding a lot of folks, especially folks who are disenfranchised and from minority communities, et cetera.
And let's create the jobs. Well, let's also create skilled workers. That takes education. That takes an investment in education, and that takes investment in technical schools and in the university.
So I mean, so where this budget debate is relevant is the budget needs to reflect, again, the common good, the needs of the people, and that isn't always happening.
Absolutely, and we're under we're under this cloud of a really crude ideology that everything public is bad and everything private is good.
Right. This goes back to the '80s.
We're speaking here in a public library. Where this studio is situated. Look at the great public parks we have, the great state and county parks we have in Wisconsin that I guess are going to be user feed to death right now. But what do we do as a public, as a community together? We pay for the great University of Wisconsin. We have, a system of roads. We used to have a DNR that would protect our water and our air. And all of that is under threat right now. But there are things we can do as a community to support the common good with some of this money that's available if we just close some of these corporate welfare loopholes, like you said, John.
Yeah.
And, educated our people and cleaned up the water supply and got rid of the lead pipes in cities and dug new wells or cleared up the water supply in rural Wisconsin, which is being contaminated by these factory farms. We could do that with some of this money.
So
we could make education free technical school for anyone who makes the grade. I mean, there are a lot of exciting things we could do with the money that's being thrown to the people who manipulate the system. If we used it for ourselves and for the broader Wisconsin common good, we'd be a lot better off in Wisconsin. So that's the fight at the budget level.
We're down to our last several minutes. We're just going to have to bring you back to talk about things like the threats to the UW system and why that investment is so important, and some of the other, again, things we're at a time when we're pulling government out where we really should be pulling in and engaging in a more meaningful way. But just the one thing I wanted these last several minutes to address, though, is this essentially things resonant with the theme of the politics of resentment, the notion that folks in Madison, Milwaukee, and the rest of the state have separate agendas and separate interests, and again, the tendency of someone in Madison, for example, to say, oh, well, if those folks outstate hadn't been so short-sighted, we wouldn't have this problem, and then understandable I'm a little sympathetic more having grown up in small towns, to that perspective, but, folks in the small towns who just say, you guys are elitists, you're trying to tell us what to do, and then we don't know what we're talking about. How do you guys as organizations try to transcend that?
Well, one thing is we've got to talk to one another.
Okay.
We're in this increasingly siloized society, and where people are on Facebook and they only hear things that resonate with them, and they're the people who agree with them. And that's true whether it's Facebook or radio or whatever. So one thing is we've got to get talking to one another, and it's so important to have meetings in those towns and for Matt to go and talk to people there. But another thing is that it's to maybe help people understand that they do use government.
Yeah.
If you're in a small town and you have a health problem, you go to a healthcare center and you count on some expertise there that may have been developed at the University of Wisconsin. People aren't as independent as they may think they are.
Kathy Kramer talks about this, and she'll be in these chairs soon. And it's this notion that these discussions in small town cafes that folks had reason for resentment to a certain extent, but they also, again, as you said, they didn't understand that in fact, statistically, a lot of money does go back to those small communities. There is a role for government.
But those same people say that we Madison, Dane County folk don't understand them. So they might be right about that too, and that we need to also open our minds. We're
down to a couple minutes. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, we need to get out of Madison, Milwaukee. We need to go across the state and talk to people where they are. One of the reasons there is resentment, though, I think, is when the Democrats were in control of government, they didn't do enough to deliver the goods. Yeah. So people couldn't identify, well, this is what this party gave me if you support the Democrats. And now, the Republicans have had power, and they're going to have to decide whether the Republicans have delivered the goods to them. But I do think we need to remind people, if you like going fishing and hunting or bird watching at Wyalusing State Park or any of the great state parks we have, that's one of the things the government did. If you like going to the library, taking your kids to the library, to get on computers at the library, look at the books in the library, that's a public good too. And we should protect our public goods and support our public goods.
Spoken like a true birder there. I like how you snuck that in.
Got to get bird watching.
You wanted to mention an event coming up on January 14th for folks watching.
January 14th in Milwaukee, Voces de la Frontera is leading a huge march in support of immigrant and refugee rights and to protest against the agenda of the Trump administration that's coming into power.
For folks who are watching this again in the next few days, we're taping this on January 6th. This Wednesday, Blue Jean Nation, headed up, of course, by your predecessor, Mike McCabe, is having a meeting at the Madison Public Library at 6:30. So I'll mention that to you. As we close out here, any things you want to highlight about upcoming events or kind of your focus moving forward, Andrea?
Well, our focus is very much on the state budget in the next few months, and we also will be getting out our Candidates Answers voter guide for the spring elections.
Just in a meeting yesterday, we were talking about that, and that's such a powerful thing. What about you guys? Where's WCDC heading in 2017?
Well, we're trying to come up with a model bill that will rectify some of the damage that was done in the campaign finance deform bill that was passed 14, 15 months ago. And then we're also working on this fair maps, supporting the redistricting lawsuit and hoping that turns out well at the U.S. Supreme Court.
All right, Andrea Kaminski from the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, Matt Rothschild from Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. Thank you so much for joining us. You guys know you have an ongoing offer, and maybe we can do several of these throughout the year and come back to these issues. Because I think the folks who are watching us around the state are really interested in this. This is central to everything that needs to happen right now. This is John Quinlan. Thank you so much for joining us for Forward Forum. Forwardforum.net is a place where you can view our archive shows or contact us here at the Sun Prairie Media Center if you have ideas for future shows or feedback. Thanks very much for joining us, and have a great week.